There's something specific about the way Steven Universe looks. If you've seen it, you know what I mean. The color palette is all soft pinks and sandy yellows and that particular shade of blue that belongs to beach towns and late summer afternoons. The houses in Beach City are slightly crooked, slightly too bright, like someone painted a real place from memory and got the details a little wrong in a way that makes it feel more real, not less. The whole visual language of the show communicates something before a single word is said. It says, "You are safe here. Whatever happens, you are in a warm place." And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment before we get into anything else. Because Steven Universe has a philosophy. Multiple philosophies, actually, layered over each other like sediment. But all of them are built on that foundation, safety. The idea that the world, or at least this small corner of it, can be a place where you are allowed to exist as you are and be cared for because of that, not in spite of it. I've wanted to make a video about this show for a long time. It's one of those pieces of work that I find myself thinking about at odd moments. Not the plot, necessarily, not the big dramatic reveals or the final battles, just the smaller things. The way a character will say something in passing that you realize 3 episodes later was actually the point. The way the music works, the way the show treats its characters with a kind of patience and attention that you don't always expect from animation or from children's television or from anything really. Steven Universe was created by Rebecca Sugar, who became Cartoon Network's first solo female creator at the time of the show's premiere. That biographical detail matters somewhat, I think, because the show is deeply personal in ways that show up in unexpected places. Sugar has spoken in interviews about her own experiences with anxiety, with identity, with the way trauma can sit in the body long after the thing that caused it is over. A lot of that made its way into the show, particularly into its later seasons and the epilogue series, Steven Universe Future. You can feel it. It doesn't make the show heavy. It makes it honest. The show ran for 5 seasons, from 2013 to 2019, followed by a feature-length film and then the epilogue series, Steven Universe Future, which wrapped up in 2020. It's a complete thing now, with a beginning and a middle and an end. What I want to do tonight, or this evening, or whenever you're listening, it is just wander through the ideas in the show. Not a plot summary, not a ranking of episodes, not a breakdown of the lore, just a look at what the show is actually thinking about. What it's trying to say about identity, and healing, and relationships, and authority, and what it means to be a person who is trying their best in a world that is confusing and sometimes painful and also sometimes genuinely beautiful. There's quite a lot to cover, so I'm going to take it section by section. Each one should sit pretty independently, so if you're listening to fall asleep and you drift off somewhere in the middle of Pearl's existential crisis or the bit about the homeworld caste system, that's completely fine. You haven't missed the point. The point will still be there if you come back to it. If you find this sort of thing helpful for winding down, and you'd like to see more videos in this vein, other shows, other philosophers, other pieces of fiction worth thinking about slowly, then subscribing would be genuinely appreciated. It helps more than you might think, but there's no pressure. We're just here to talk about a cartoon tonight, so, Steven Universe. Let's start at the beginning, which is also conveniently where the show starts, with the boy himself. The very first thing Steven Universe does in the pilot episode is establish that its main character is not going to be a traditional hero. Not in the way we're used to, anyway. Steven Universe, the character, not the show, is a chubby, cheerful, slightly naive 14-year-old boy who lives in a town called Beach City with 3 alien warriors. He loves a fictional ice cream brand called Cookie Cat. He makes sandwiches. He cries fairly regularly and doesn't seem embarrassed about it. He's the kind of kid who, when he learns that someone is sad, immediately wants to know why and what he can do to help. That's not a peripheral trait. That's the whole character. That's the point. The show exists in a genre that has very clear rules about what a hero looks like. Action, adventure, animation, particularly the kind aimed at kids, tends to have a protagonist who is brave in a specific way. Physically, loudly, confrontationally. They fight their way through problems. They power up. They overcome obstacles through force of will and the ability to punch things harder than the last time. This is not a criticism of those shows. That model produces genuinely great storytelling sometimes. But it is a model, and Steven Universe is quite deliberately not following it. Steven's powers, when they arrive, are interesting precisely because of what they are. He can project a shield, he can heal, he can create bubbles that protect people. His offensive capabilities are pretty limited in the early seasons. The show is built so that the gems, garnet, amethyst, pearl, do the fighting while Steven finds other ways to contribute. And the ways he contributes, over and over again, are emotional. He talks to monsters, he listens to villains, he apologizes when he doesn't need to, and means it when he does. He is, without the show ever announcing this in a self-congratulatory way, emotionally intelligent in a way that turns out to be more useful than anyone expected. There's a philosophical tradition that talks about what's sometimes called the ethics of care. It's not a single unified school of thought, but a loosely connected set of ideas associated with thinkers like Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings that argues moral life is fundamentally about relationships and responsiveness, about attending to the needs of particular people in particular situations rather than applying abstract rules. The ethics of care is sometimes gendered in academic discussions, which is its own interesting complication. But what Steven Universe does is take that mode of being, attentive, relational, fundamentally oriented toward the well-being of others, and put it in the body of a male protagonist and call it heroism, without making a speech about it, without once saying, "And this is why emotional intelligence matters, children." It just shows him being that way, and it shows that way of being solving problems that brute force couldn't. The most important example of this, and it comes up again and again throughout the whole run of the show, is Steven's relationship with his enemies, or rather his ex-enemies. Characters who are introduced as antagonists and who, through sustained contact with Steven's particular brand of care and attention, stop being antagonists. Peridot, who we'll talk about properly later. Lapis. The diamonds themselves, eventually. Even Jasper at the very end in a way that the show earns even if it doesn't entirely resolve. Steven's answer to "there is a being who wants to hurt me or the people I love" is almost never defeat them. It's almost always find out why they're like this. That is genuinely radical in the context of children's action animation. And it's philosophically interesting because it embeds a particular view of human and non-human nature. The view that people aren't bad by nature, but hurt. That aggression is usually pain wearing a different costume. That the question worth asking almost always is not "how do I stop this threat?" but "what made this into a threat in the first place?" You can agree or disagree with that as a life philosophy. I find it mostly convincing, with caveats. But the show presents it not as naivety. Steven isn't portrayed as foolish for believing it, but as genuine insight that other characters slowly come around to. He's not wrong. The show takes care to show him not being wrong. The empathy is validated. There's also something worth noting about Steven's emotional expression specifically. He cries often. He says "I love you" to his father, to the gems, to his friends. He apologizes and he means it. He doesn't think these things make him weak or embarrassing. And the show never frames them as weaknesses. No character laughs at Steven for crying. No adult tells him to toughen up. The emotional openness is treated as entirely normal, as something that belongs in the same show as laser fights and alien shapeshifters. Because of course it does. These things coexist in real people all the time. Rebecca Sugar has spoken about wanting to create a male protagonist who was allowed to be emotionally expressive in the way that female protagonists often are, but male protagonists rarely are, in mainstream children's animation. That intention is visible in the finished product. You can feel the deliberateness of it, but it never feels like a lesson being delivered. It just feels like a kid being himself and the show saying, "Yes, this is fine, this is good, actually." What Steven represents, philosophically, is something like the argument that how you engage with the world, the quality of your attention, your willingness to be present with difficult people and difficult feelings, matters as much as what you can do. That the capacity for care is a form of power, not a limitation on it. The show builds an entire dramatic structure around that argument and then demonstrates it case by case over 5 seasons and an epilogue. It's a generous view of what a person can be. I find it quite comforting to think about, honestly, even when I don't entirely live up to it. There's one more thing worth noting about Steven as a character before we move on, which is the way the show handles his mistakes. Because he does make mistakes. He's not portrayed as the emotional perfection point of the team, someone who always gets it right and whose capacity for empathy is flawless and infallible. There are episodes where his help makes things worse. There are seasons where the weight of his optimism becomes a kind of pressure on the people around him. The expectation that if he just talks to someone long enough and kindly enough, they'll come around. Some people don't come around. Not everyone is a parrot waiting to be understood into a friend. The show is aware of this and lets the failures land. In Steven Universe Future specifically, Steven's tendency to try to fix everything, to position himself as the solution to every problem, the one who can reach people no one else can, is partly a reflection of his genuine gift and partly a symptom of his trauma. The two things are not separate. His capacity for care developed under conditions that were not healthy, in response to real necessity, and the same quality that makes him remarkable in a crisis makes him unable to stop treating ordinary life as a crisis he needs to manage. That complication makes him more interesting and more real than a straightforwardly perfect, empathetic hero would be. He is trying, with genuine love, and he is sometimes wrong about what the situation calls for. And the show holds all of this together without resolving the tension prematurely. The empathy is real and valuable, and also, in certain configurations, a way of not looking directly at his own pain. Both things are true at the same time. One of the things the show does exceptionally well is hide how sad its characters are. The crystal gems, garnet, amethyst, and pearl, are introduced as Steven's guardians and teachers. They are magical alien warriors who have been protecting Earth for thousands of years. They are also, as the show gradually reveals, 3 people in the middle of very long, very unresolved grief. The early episodes are cheerful. Monster of the Week format. Steven learning a new power, or failing to learn it, or accidentally causing a different kind of problem while trying to help. It takes a while before you fully clock how much the 3 gems are carrying beneath all the fighting and the quipping. Let me talk about each of them individually, because they're each doing something quite specific. Garnet is the leader of the crystal gems. She's tall, calm, and speaks in short, declarative sentences. She has future vision, the ability to see possible outcomes, and she tends to use this to project a kind of unflappable certainty about what to do next. In the early seasons, she can feel slightly opaque compared to Pearl and Amethyst, who are more obviously chaotic. She gives orders. She holds the group together. She's warm with Steven, but not expressive in the way Pearl is, or even in the volatile way Amethyst sometimes is. And then you find out, in the season 1 finale, that Garnet isn't one person. She's a fusion, a permanent, continuous merging of 2 gems called Ruby and Sapphire, who fell in love under circumstances we'll come back to in the fusion section. They've been together, as Garnet, for thousands of years. The calm, the certainty, the sense of absolute groundedness. All of that is what it looks like when 2 people who love each other deeply have been choosing to stay together across millennia. Garnet is love made literal, made structural, made permanent. What that does to your understanding of her character is interesting. The opacity, in retrospect, reads differently. She doesn't need to explain herself because she is already, at all times, in a conversation with herself. 2 people who know each other completely, who have spent an impossible amount of time together and still choose each other. Of course, that looks like stillness from the outside. It is stillness. Earned, intimate, ancient stillness. Pearl is almost the opposite in terms of presentation. She's anxious and precise and deeply, visibly invested in doing things correctly. She's the kind of person who would spend 3 hours color coding a filing system and feel genuinely satisfied about it. She cares about order and competence and being useful. She also, the show makes gradually clear, built her entire sense of self around Rose Quartz, Steven's mother, and the leader of the Crystal Gem Rebellion against the Gem Homeworld. We'll spend a whole section on Rose later. For now, the relevant fact is that Pearl loved Rose more than she loved anything else, and Rose is gone, and Pearl has been trying to figure out who she is without that defining relationship for the entire duration of the show. On Homeworld, Pearls are the servant class, decorative, obedient, expected to reflect their owner's personality rather than have one of their own. Rose essentially gave Pearl permission to be a person, to have opinions, to fight, to matter. And Pearl structured her whole identity around that permission. The problem with building your sense of self around another person's validation of you is fairly obvious in retrospect. But it's a very human thing to do, and the show handles it without ever making Pearl pathetic for it. Amethyst is the most outwardly chaotic of the three. She's loud and impulsive, eats things she definitely shouldn't eat, stays up all night doing things that serve no purpose, and has historically dealt with anything uncomfortable by pretending it isn't uncomfortable. She's funny. She's also, underneath all of that, carrying something quite specific. She was made on Earth. In the Gem Homeworld's understanding of things, every gem is grown in a kindergarten. Literally a site where gems are manufactured from the minerals of a planet, draining that planet's life in the process. Amethyst came from the prime kindergarten on Earth, and she came out wrong, too small, too late. By Homeworld standards, she's defective, a gem who didn't meet the specifications she was supposed to meet. She's never been to Homeworld. She has no idea as to what a normal amethyst is supposed to be. And yet she carries this knowledge of her own supposed inadequacy like a stone in her pocket. The early season episodes that start to crack open this backstory, particularly the episode On the Run, where she and Steven end up at the prime kindergarten, and she starts talking about what it means to her, are genuinely surprising in how much feeling they contain under what looked like a comedy character surface. What all three of them have in common is that they've been holding things together for thousands of years, without anyone to hold them. They've been protecting Earth and protecting each other, and in the process they have all had to make certain kinds of peace with grief and loss and uncertainty that they haven't quite actually made peace with. They've just been continuing, which is, in fairness, what people do. Steven's presence changes things, slowly. Not because he fixes them. The show is careful not to make him responsible for healing anyone, but because he's a new variable. He doesn't have the same relationship to the war, to Rose, to the history they all share. He asks questions without knowing he shouldn't. He doesn't understand why certain things are painful. And in not understanding, he sometimes breaks through the careful architecture of avoidance that everyone has been maintaining. There's a lot of quiet wisdom in how the show handles the crystal gems as a unit. They're a found family, which is a well-worn storytelling concept, but the show does something specific with it. It shows the found family not as a replacement for biological family, but as a structure that can hold grief and love simultaneously, that doesn't require its members to be well or functional to belong. They're all a bit broken. They're all staying anyway. The belonging is not conditional on recovery. That's a genuinely hopeful thing to suggest about what home can be. There's also something to be said about the temporal scale the show operates on. These characters are thousands of years old. They've seen things we can barely imagine. The human relationships Steven is building in Beach City are, from their perspective, very brief. Humans are mortal. They flickered in and out. The gems have watched generations come and go. And yet the show treats Steven's human friendships as fully real and fully valuable, no less so for being brief. There's something in there about how the shortness of something doesn't diminish its meaning. That's a fairly standard philosophical position, but it's one thing to state it abstractly, and another to demonstrate it through narrative, which the show does well. The crystal gems, across the run of the show, each move through their grief and damage at different rates and in different ways. None of them arrives at a neat resolution. Amethyst gets more comfortable with herself, mostly. Pearl builds new relationships that aren't built on devotion to another person, mostly. Garnet stays Garnet, which is the best outcome any of them could have hoped for. It's not triumphant. It's just gradual, honest, and recognizably true. Let me tell you about fusion, because it's probably the most philosophically layered thing in the entire show, and it's worth taking some time with. In the gem universe, fusion is the ability for two or more gems to merge into a single new being. Physically, it's expressed through a kind of synchronized dance. The gems move together, and then, in a moment that's usually accompanied by a flash of light, they become something new. The fused being is larger, often has more arms, has a different voice, a different name, a different personality that is nonetheless traceable to both of its components. It's not that the original gems disappear. They're both still there, inhabiting this shared form together, feeling what the other feels, thinking in a kind of chorus. The show uses this mechanic as a metaphor for relationships in the broadest possible sense. Not just romantic ones, though the romantic dimension is obviously present, but any relationship in which two people are changed by each other, in which contact between people creates something that neither of them is alone. Writer Matt Burnett confirmed this when fans asked. Fusion represents a relationship, full stop. Which means that every fusion in the show is a portrait of a specific kind of connection, with all the health or dysfunction that connection carries. And the show is very deliberate about this. Garnet, as we touched on, is the most important fusion in the show. She is Ruby and Sapphire, two gems who met under circumstances covered in the episode The Answer, one of the most visually beautiful episodes the show ever produced, drawn in a storybook style. Warm and soft and slightly dreamlike. Ruby was a gem soldier. Sapphire was a gem with future vision, part of Blue Diamond's court. They accidentally fused when Ruby tried to protect Sapphire from harm, which was not permitted. Fusions between different types of gems were forbidden, under the gem homeworld's rules, being considered undignified and improper. The resulting fusion, the first Garnet, was so unexpected and disorienting to everyone present that Ruby and Sapphire used the confusion to escape, and they just stayed together, not because they had to, because they wanted to, because what they'd briefly experienced felt like something worth having. The revelation of Garnet's true nature is saved for the Season 1 finale, Jailbreak. Steven is captured, the crystal gems are separated and imprisoned, and he has to navigate the enemy ship alone. He finds Ruby in one cell and Sapphire in another, helps them find each other, and then watches them fuse back into Garnet. The show has been building to this reveal for the entire first season. If you watch the season knowing what Garnet is, you can see the seams, the moments when the show almost tells you, the careful structuring of her dialogue and behavior. But if you don't know, the reveal is extraordinary. It reframes everything. Garnet, then, in the episode's climax, sings "Stronger Than You," one of the most directly political songs in a show full of interesting music. The lyrics are addressed to Jasper, the episode's villain, who has been contemptuous of fusion throughout. Garnet's argument, in song form, is essentially, you think I'm weak because I'm a fusion, because I'm built on a relationship that your hierarchy says is inappropriate, but the thing you're calling weakness is the source of everything I am. I am made of love, and it's stronger than you. That is a remarkable thing to put in a children's cartoon in 2014, and the show never feels the need to underline it. It just lets it be what it is. The contrast case for what fusion can become when it goes wrong is Malachite, the fusion of lapis lazuli and jasper. This happens at the end of season 1, under duress. Jasper forces Lapis into the fusion to escape. Lapis consents to it, but with a specific trapped intention. She'll fuse with Jasper in order to restrain Jasper. She uses the fusion to cage them both at the bottom of the ocean, keeping Jasper contained by keeping herself contained alongside her. It's one of the most unsettling things in the show, and the show knows it. Malachite is a fusion of mutual suffering and coercion, a relationship built on entrapment rather than love. And visually she looks exactly like that. Unstable, enormous, deeply uncomfortable. The episode Alone at Sea, when Jasper reappears much later and tries to convince Lapis to refuse with her, is written and performed like a domestic abuse dynamic, specifically. Jasper keeps saying she needs the fusion, that she felt something in it, that they were incredible together. Lapis is visibly destabilized by the encounter, even as she refuses. The show is doing something quite careful here. It's showing that even toxic relationships can feel significant to the people in them, and that significance doesn't make them okay. That someone wanting something from you doesn't mean you owe it to them. Consent is the mechanical requirement for fusion. You can't fuse with someone who doesn't want to. Attempted non-consensual fusions fail. This is not an accident. The show is building consent into the fundamental physics of its universe. Relationships, real ones, require both people to actually choose to be there. There are other fusions worth mentioning. Stevani, who first appears in the episode Alone Together, is the fusion of Steven and his best friend Connie. Stevani uses they/them pronouns and is read by different characters in different ways. Some characters are attracted to them. Some characters are confused. The show doesn't particularly explain or resolve the ambiguity. Stevani is a beautiful teenager who makes people feel things, and the show just lets that be true without making a lesson of it. In Stevani's episodes, the show tends to explore how it feels to be noticed in ways that are uncomfortable, to be perceived in ways that don't match how you feel about yourself. It's a subtle, interesting use of the metaphor. There's also Sugalite, who is the fusion of garnet and amethyst, massive, loud, chaotic, overpowering. The episode that features her is partly about what happens when a fusion becomes an end in itself rather than a means, when two people stop being individuals and just become the combined thing permanently. It's a cautionary note about losing yourself in a relationship, which is different from the healthy kind of merging that garnet represents. The philosophical point the show makes through fusion, cumulatively, is something like this. We are changed by the people we are close to. Proximity to another person creates something that is more than just you and them in the same space. It creates a kind of third thing, a relationship space that has its own character. Whether that third thing is beautiful or terrible depends entirely on the quality of what both people bring to it and whether both people actually want to be there. The gem fusion mechanic makes this literal, it visualizes it. And by making it visible and physical and consequential, the show lets children and adults watching with children, or adults watching alone at whatever time of night this is, engage with that idea at a level that's both accessible and emotionally real. I think it's genuinely one of the more elegant uses of science fiction metaphor I've come across. Not because it's complicated, but because it's so clean. The idea maps on so naturally that you can use it as a framework for thinking about your own relationships without it feeling forced. I talked about garnet in the context of fusion, and that framing is important and correct. But there's more to say about her as an individual, or rather, as a combined individual, which is itself part of what's interesting, because she does something philosophically unusual for a protagonist in an action-adventure show. Garnet doesn't doubt herself. This is rarer than it sounds. Children's animation, and action-adventure storytelling more generally, tends to run on the drama of protagonists who are uncertain about their abilities, their identity, their purpose. The uncertainty creates stakes. Will they figure it out in time? Will they believe in themselves enough to succeed? That structure is fine and useful, but Garnet is not built on that structure. She knows who she is, she knows what she's doing. She makes decisions from a place of genuine groundedness, and while she sometimes makes mistakes, she's wrong about things sometimes. Her future vision doesn't give her complete knowledge. She doesn't lose her footing the way other characters do. What makes this philosophically interesting is the source of her certainty. It's not arrogance, it's not a performance of confidence covering something more fragile. It's genuine. She is certain because she is, at every moment, in active relationship with two people who love each other and who know each other completely. That relationship is her foundation. Ruby and Sapphire don't always agree. They argue inside the fusion and as separate gems when they unfuse. but the love is constant, and the choice to be together is continuous. That constancy is what Garnet is made of. There's something to be said about the ethics of certainty here, because certainty can be a problem in leaders. It can become inflexibility, an inability to receive new information, a confidence that overrides rather than incorporates the perspectives of others. Garnet occasionally edges toward this. In the episode Keeping It Together, she is so shaken by what she discovers that she can barely function. And the shattering happens specifically because her certainty is confronted with something she hadn't prepared for. The show shows the limits of even grounded certainty, but what Garnet generally models is something I'd call earned groundedness. She has thought carefully about who she is over a very long time. She has built her sense of self on something durable, on love, chosen, and renewed, on the alignment between her values and her actions. She doesn't need external validation because the validation is internal. She doesn't need anyone else's approval of her relationship because the relationship doesn't require approval to be real. That kind of self-possession is actually quite difficult to write without making a character seem cold or unapproachable. The show manages it because it shows Garnet's warmth within her certainty, her specific, attentive kindness with Steven, the way she sometimes says the single most exactly right thing in a situation, the quiet delight she takes in dancing, her genuine love of the crystal gems even when she knows they're frustrating. The certainty is the ground. The warmth is what grows in it. The episode Mindful Education pairs Garnet with Stevonnie in a meditation sequence that is, in retrospect, one of the most explicit statements of Garnet's philosophy. She teaches Stevonnie, and by extension the audience, that thoughts that feel overwhelming are smaller than they seem when you see them whole. She can teach this because she practices something like it herself. She holds difficult realities without being destroyed by them. She sees hard things clearly and continues anyway. That is the practice. It's not stoicism in the classical sense. It's warmer than that, more relational. It's something more like equanimity grounded in love, a stability that comes not from indifference but from being very well anchored to what matters. The episode Keystone Motel in Season 2 is probably the best showcase of what Garnet actually is when the foundation is tested. Ruby and Sapphire are fighting, properly fighting, not just disagreeing, and they unfuse. They have to work through the argument as two separate people before they can return to being Garnet. What the episode shows is that Garnet's certainty isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of a relationship strong enough to hold conflict, process it, and come through on the other side still intact. Ruby in that episode is furious. She's hot and stubborn and convinced she's right, and finds being wrong almost physically painful. Sapphire is cold in her own way, retreating into a certainty about the future that's a kind of avoidance, using knowledge of what's coming as a reason not to engage with what's happening right now. They are, in their separate forms, both flawed in specific ways that their fusion manages to balance and transform. Garnet is not just the combination of their individual qualities. She's what those qualities produce when they're in genuine relationship with each other, when the stubbornness of Ruby and the foresight of Sapphire have to negotiate constantly into something workable. That's a more interesting model of psychological stability than this character simply has their life together. Garnet is well because she is always in the process of being well, actively, relationally, through ongoing work rather than arrived at achievement. The groundedness is not a state she reached once and now maintains effortlessly. It's a practice she and Ruby and Sapphire have been engaged in for thousands of years, which, in a show full of characters who are carrying their damage and trying to put it down, makes Garnet something like a useful reminder that it's possible. Not easy, not done, but possible. Pearl deserves her own section, and I want to be honest, up front, that I find her the most compelling character in the show. I don't think that's a controversial position among fans, but I know it's not universal either. She can be difficult to like in certain stretches, she lies, she's controlling, she makes choices that hurt Steven and others out of misplaced protectiveness. But she's doing all of that because of something that I find genuinely philosophically interesting, and the show is patient enough with her that it earns the complexity. So let's start at the beginning, which in Pearl's case means homeworld. In the gem hierarchy, pearls are the servant class. They are made to be decorative, to be useful to their assigned diamond, and to reflect their owner's wishes rather than have wishes of their own. This is not subtle in the show. Other gems call pearl someone's pearl in a dismissive way, or express confusion at the idea of a pearl having opinions, leading battles, having feelings that inconvenience other people. A pearl is a possession. She has a function, and the function is service. The pearl we know, the crystal gem. Pearl specifically, was Pink Diamond's pearl before she was Rose Quartz's pearl, and the story of how she moved from one to the other is tied up in the whole Pink Diamond / Rose Quartz revelation we'll get to later. What matters for now is what Rose gave Pearl that Homeworld didn't. Permission. Permission to be a person, to want things, to fight, to matter in ways that had nothing to do with being decorative or useful to a superior. The existentialist philosophy of the 20th century talked a lot about what it means to find yourself thrown into a world with no pre-given purpose, to have to invent the reasons to be alive rather than receive them from somewhere outside yourself. That's a famously difficult position to occupy. Pearl's case is almost the inverse. She didn't arrive at the freedom to define herself. That freedom was granted to her by someone else. Her self was constituted in relation to Rose. And when Rose was gone, Pearl had to figure out how to have a self that was hers, not contingent on another person's existence, not structured around being needed or valued by a specific person, but just hers. That is genuinely hard. I think anyone who has ever lost a relationship that defined them, a long partnership that ended, or a friendship that was the architecture of your daily life, or a job or a role that was how you understood yourself, will recognize something in Pearl's situation. The form is extraordinary. Thousands of years of devotion to a magical alien revolutionary leader. The feeling underneath it is ordinary enough to be painful. Pearl's grief is long and non-linear. She has good seasons and bad seasons. She makes peace with some things and circles back to others. There are episodes relatively late in the show where she's still being blindsided by the grief, where Rose's absence hits her in unexpected contexts. That's realistic. Real grief doesn't follow a 5-stage model and arrive at acceptance on a fixed schedule. It resurfaces. It catches you off guard. It is, unfortunately, as patient as you are impatient with it. There's a song in the show, in the episode Mr. Greg, that captures Pearl's specific grief better than any piece of dialogue in the show. The episode is a musical, which is a slightly unusual format choice, and Pearl and Greg, Steven's dad, Rose's former partner, spend most of it in an elaborate dance around their mutual grief and mutual resentment. Greg got Rose at the end of her life. He has Steven. He had the thing Pearl wanted and couldn't have, for reasons that are complicated by the Pink Diamond revelation. The song Pearl sings in that episode, "It's Over, Isn't It?" is about knowing that the person you love has made a choice that doesn't include you, and understanding it, and still not being able to make the feeling stop. It's a song about unrequited love, but specifically about unrequited love that was partly requited, but not in the way that mattered, which is a more complicated grief than pure unrequited love, and the song sits with that complication rather than resolving it. I won't go into the lyrics in detail because I can't reproduce them here. But the song exists, it is in the show. I recommend watching the episode on its own merits. Pearl's philosophical journey is also about what she is beyond her relationships. One of the things you notice, if you watch carefully, is that Pearl is genuinely talented at fighting, at building things, at strategy, at the careful reconstruction of historical events she's actually witnessed. She knows things no one else knows. She has skills that are fully her own. And yet she's spent most of her existence understanding those skills as things she was doing in service of someone else's project rather than as part of her own story. The process of claiming them as hers, of understanding herself as someone who has a story rather than just a role in someone else's, is quietly ongoing throughout the show. By the time you get to Steven Universe Future, Pearl is in a different place than she was at the start of the main series. She has her own interests and connections that aren't defined by devotion to Rose. She teaches, she explores, she is still recognizably Pearl, still anxious, still precise, still capable of being intense in ways that can be maddening to the people around her. But the intensity is pointed at the world differently. It's pointed outward rather than inward. She doesn't become a different person. She becomes more fully herself, which is, I think, the most anyone can hope for. There's a minor philosophical tradition associated with feminism and specifically with the work of Simone de Beauvoir that talks about the danger of what's sometimes called living for another, of a person, historically often a woman, who structures their entire existence around another person's needs and desires and in the process loses the ability to be the subject of their own life. Pearl is, I think, a very clear-eyed depiction of this dynamic. The show doesn't judge her for it. It traces the reasons for it, the way those reasons made complete sense within the world she inhabited. And then it follows her through the slow, difficult process of becoming her own subject. It does this without preaching. It just shows her, episode after episode, in the mess and the occasional grace of that process. That's the kind of storytelling I find most interesting. Not storytelling that tells you what to think, but storytelling that shows you something so clearly and honestly that you can do the thinking yourself. Amethyst is, on the surface, comic relief. She eats motor oil for fun. She's deeply committed to not taking anything seriously at exactly the moments when seriousness would be most appropriate. She shapeshifts into things that she thinks are funny when she should be focusing. She has, in the early episodes especially, a quality of being perpetually in motion, never quite settling, always looking for the next thing to do that isn't the thing that needs to be done. That quality is, of course, a defense mechanism. It just takes the show a while to let you see what it's defending against. Amethyst was made in the prime kindergarten on Earth. This is the location where gems are manufactured, or grown in the show's language, by drilling holes into the mineral-rich earth and allowing gems to form and eventually emerge. The process drains the surrounding land, kills organic life, leaves behind an area of dead soil and ruined terrain. The kindergartens are, in a way, the show's most literal depiction of what Homeworld's colonialism looks like in physical reality. A planet hollowed out to make soldiers. Amethyst emerged too late and came out too small. By the standards of other amethysts, there are many, across many kindergartens. She is an anomaly. When she first encounters other amethysts from the Thist, the group of quartzes from the prime kindergarten who ended up working at the human zoo, she is visibly smaller. Her gem is in a different place. She is different in ways that she has been told. Implicitly or explicitly mark her as defective. She has never been to Homeworld. She's never met another gem who looks like what she was supposed to look like. She grew up on Earth with the crystal gems who have their own damage and their own ways of not quite being fully present with her. And she absorbed the knowledge of her own supposed inadequacy without having a context that could counter it. The episode that breaks this open most directly is On the Run in Season 1. It's one of those episodes that looks like a fun adventure on the surface and then turns into something much more uncomfortable. Steven and Amethyst go on a trip to the prime kindergarten, partly at Steven's instigation, partly because Amethyst can't stop herself from going back. And there, standing in the dead, hollow landscape where she came from, she starts to say the thing she hasn't been saying. That she came from something that hurt the planet. That she is, structurally, the product of something bad. That there is something wrong with her, at the level of her origin. And Steven, who is about 12 and doesn't have a philosophical framework for this, does what Steven does. He refuses the logic entirely. Not through argument, just through the simple fact of his regard for her. She exists. She is his friend. He cannot make the idea of her being fundamentally defective make sense to him because it conflicts too directly with his experience of who she actually is. That's not a resolution to Amethyst's crisis of self-worth. It doesn't fix anything, but it's something. It's a data point she didn't have before. The show's deeper engagement with Amethyst's philosophy comes through her encounters with Jasper. Jasper is, by homeworld standards, the perfect quartz, large, powerful, a skilled fighter who takes enormous pride in her function and her origins. She came from the same kindergarten as Amethyst and emerged exactly as she was supposed to. She has nothing but contempt for Amethyst, who is everything Jasper is supposed to be, but less of it. And there's something interesting in how Amethyst responds to Jasper. Not with simple hatred, but with a complicated mix of resentment and recognition, and the specific kind of envy that comes from seeing the thing you were supposed to be embodied in someone else. In the episode Crack the Whip, Jasper defeats Amethyst easily in combat and uses the opportunity to be comprehensively cruel about Amethyst's inadequacy. Amethyst eventually spends time in later seasons actively training, trying to get stronger, trying to become more of what she's supposed to be. The show doesn't fully endorse this project. Steven Universe is not a show about self-improvement through effort and discipline, exactly. It's more interested in self-acceptance than self-perfection. The arc Amethyst completes by the later seasons is not one in which she becomes a bigger, better quartz. It's one in which she stops orienting her understanding of herself around the quartz standard at all. She is what she is. She came from where she came from. The circumstances of her origin were bad, in a structural sense. The kindergartens were harmful. The colonization they were part of was harmful. But that doesn't make her bad. She is the thing that emerged from those circumstances. She gets to decide what to do with that. There is a philosophical concept sometimes called natal natality, associated with Hannah Arendt, which is about the radical fact of having been born into a world you didn't choose, with a nature you didn't choose, and the idea that what you do from there is genuinely open. The circumstances of your origin don't determine your story. You are new. Amethyst's arc, slow and often painful and sometimes 3 steps back for every 2 forward, is roughly that. She is new. Even though she came from somewhere old and damaging, she gets to be new. The other thing worth noting about Amethyst is that she ends up as a genuinely important figure among the Famethist, the other Amethysts who were encountered at the Human Zoo in Season 4. She's different from them, and she's always known she's different from the standard Amethyst template, but they embrace the differences rather than treating them as failures. That episode, That Will Be All, is relatively quick, but it contains this lovely beat where Amethyst realizes that the group she was supposedly inadequate compared to actually just likes her as she is. The relief in that moment is very specific. It's a small thing, but small things accumulate in this show into something quite large. I want to talk carefully about Rose, because the show talks carefully about Rose, and carelessness here would be a disservice to what it's doing. Rose Quartz is Steven's mother. She is, for the first 2.5 seasons or so of the show, an absence. She gave up her physical form to give birth to Steven. Gems can only have children this way, apparently, and the child gets the gem. And so she exists in the show only through other people's memories, some artifacts, and a sentient pink lion called Lion, who is carrying around more of her secrets than anyone knew to ask about. The picture the show builds of Rose, through these indirect means, is of someone extraordinary, magnificent, the leader of a rebellion, a figure of almost overwhelming love and generosity and care for life. And then, roughly halfway through Season 5, the show reveals that Rose Quartz was actually Pink Diamond, one of the 4 rulers of the Gem Empire, who had secretly been faking her own death and running the Crystal Gem Rebellion under a false identity for thousands of years. The fan community spent a significant amount of time predicting this reveal. Once it happened, the reaction was mixed. Some people felt betrayed. They'd spent years invested in Rose as a heroic figure, and suddenly she had been a diamond, one of the rulers of a totalitarian empire all along. Others felt it made the show richer and more honest. I'm in the second camp, though I understand the first. Here's what actually happened, as the show reconstructs it. Pink Diamond was the youngest and smallest of the diamonds, given Earth as her first colony. She arrived there expecting to feel the thrill of power and expansion that the other diamonds had described, and instead she fell in love with the planet, with organic life, with the way humans and animals and plants existed in their brief, small, unrepeatable ways. She asked the other diamonds to stop the colonization. They refused. She argued and pleaded. They said no, and Yellow Diamond told her to make an example of the settlers if she had to, if it made her feel better, but the colony was happening. Pink Diamond, who didn't have a lot of good options, invented an option. She and her Pearl staged her death. Pearl used a shape-shifting ability to appear as Rose and shatter Pink Diamond in front of witnesses, generating enough chaos that Pink could slip away, regenerate in a new form, and permanently become Rose Quartz. The Crystal Gem Rebellion she'd been running on the side became the primary narrative of her life. Her name became Rose. Pink Diamond was dead, except she wasn't. The philosophical complication of this is enormous, and the show sits with it rather than resolving it. Because Rose's motivations were genuinely good. She was trying to protect the planet and the life on it. She was defying an authority structure that was profoundly wrong, but in doing so she lied to everyone around her. The crystal gems she recruited genuinely believed in a fictional origin story she had invented for herself, except for Pearl, who knew, and the consequences of those lies rippled outward for thousands of years. The crystal gems spent centuries believing that their leader had been murdered. Greg fell in love with a person who was, in a specific sense, not entirely who she said she was. Stephen spent his childhood carrying the weight of a legacy that had been built on a foundation of misdirection. The show's question, and it's asked rather than answered, is whether Rose was a good person. The answer is, I think deliberately, not exactly. She was a person who did some things that were courageous and right, and who did some things that were reckless and self-serving and damaging to the people who trusted her, and who is not alive to be held accountable for any of it. That is a very realistic portrait of a complicated person. Real people are not good or bad. They are mixtures, and the mixtures are not always comfortable proportions. What's interesting is how the show distributes the emotional fallout. Garnet, who was born in a sense during the war Rose was running, is shaken. Sapphire, whose future vision couldn't penetrate Rose's deception, is furious. Amethyst is more philosophical about it, probably because Amethyst has more practice accepting complicated origin stories. Pearl, who knew, has a different kind of reckoning. And Stephen, who has been living under the weight of his mother's reputation, who has spent seasons worrying about whether he's good enough to deserve the gift of Rose's gem and therefore Rose's power, who has encountered evidence that Rose wasn't exactly who he'd been told she was. Stephen has to separate himself from her entirely. The culmination of his arc across the main series and into future is his ability to say, I am not my mother. I am not her legacy. I am just myself. Which sounds simple and is probably the hardest thing the show asks any of its characters to accomplish. There's a Jungian concept, sometimes called the shadow, that describes the aspects of a person that are kept hidden, not necessarily dark, just unacknowledged, pushed out of consciousness. Rose's shadow is enormous. The diamond she was, the choices she made and didn't make, the things she didn't tell people, all of it is a shadow that falls across Stephen and across the crystal gems and across the entire history of the Gem War. The show's later seasons are partly about that shadow, about what it costs to live in it and how you start to step out of it. The show doesn't redeem Rose entirely. It doesn't condemn her entirely either. It just asks you to hold the complexity, which is honestly the most any piece of fiction can ask of its audience. Complexity held honestly is rarer than it seems. I've mentioned Rebecca Sugar a few times throughout this, and I want to spend a little more time on why her specific perspective on this show matters for understanding it. Sugar was 25 when she developed Steven Universe. She had been working on Adventure Time as a writer and storyboard artist, and had contributed some of that show's most emotionally ambitious episodes. She is bisexual and has spoken publicly about how her own experience of identity, of not fitting neatly into the categories that were available, informed the show she made. The Crystal Gems, who are all technically non-binary in the show's universe, gems don't have gender in the homeworld sense, though the show largely uses she/her pronouns for them as a default, with exceptions. The fusion mechanics, the off colors, the explicit ruby and sapphire relationship, all of this is personal as well as political. It comes from somewhere real. Sugar has also talked about the show as being partly about her relationship with her brother, Steven Sugar, who worked as a background artist on the show and after whom the character is loosely modeled. The relationship between Rebecca and Steven Sugar, his cheerfulness and warmth, her love for him, the dynamic between them, is somewhere in the texture of the show, in the way Steven the character relates to the people around him. And then there's what she said about Steven Universe Future specifically. In interviews around the epilogue series, she spoke about her own experiences with trauma and recovery in ways that are quite open. She described an experience of assault in her early 20s and the aftermath of that, the period of not understanding what was happening to her body and her perception, the sense that because she had escaped, nothing had happened, the gradual recognition that something had happened and that her nervous system was processing it on its own schedule, regardless of what she consciously believed. That experience, mediated through research and reflection, became part of what Future is about. That biographical context doesn't tell you what to think about the show or how to evaluate it. Art stands independently of its creator's life, but it does explain the precision with which Future handles what it handles. The accuracy of the PTSD depiction, the care taken with how trauma manifests in the body, the refusal to let recovery be a simple or triumphant narrative. These come from actual knowledge, from someone who went through something and then thought carefully about it, and then found a way to put it into a story. There's something I find meaningful about that chain. Experience to reflection, to story, to an audience that includes people going through similar experiences who see themselves, perhaps for the first time, in a piece of fiction. Steven Universe Future had, by many accounts, exactly this effect. People watched it and found language for things they hadn't been able to name. That's not a minor thing. That's one of the most significant things fiction can do. Rebecca Sugar made a show that was, in the end, about how it feels to be a complicated person in a complicated world, trying your best and sometimes failing and continuing anyway. She made it with warmth and honesty and considerable craft, and she put a lot of herself into it. That tends to show. The shows that people carry with them long after they've finished watching them are usually the ones someone made from somewhere real. This was one of those shows. I think it will continue to be. There's one last small observation that I want to leave you with. Across every section we've covered tonight, the characters, the philosophy, the music, the personal dimension, there's a thread that runs through all of it. The show believes that being known is valuable, that the act of one person genuinely attending to another, trying to understand them, refusing to reduce them to a category or a function or a role, that act matters. It changes things. Steven does it with almost everyone he meets. The gems do it with each other, slowly and imperfectly. The show does it with its characters, including the ones who cause harm, by tracing the reasons for what they do without excusing what they do. And, in its best moments, it does it with the viewer, by putting on screen experiences and feelings that are real and specific enough that someone watching can feel genuinely seen. That's a lot to do. Steven Universe mostly manages it. That feels worth celebrating, at whatever time of night this happens to be for you. One of the things that makes Homeworld so effective as a setting is that it doesn't feel like a cartoon villain society. It feels recognizable. A place where every person is made to serve a specific function, where that function determines your social standing, the respect you receive, where you're allowed to go, who you're allowed to consider an equal. No mobility between castes, no deviation from the role you were assigned at formation. Deviation is called being defective, and the consequences range from social exclusion to shattering, which is the gem equivalent of death. That's the gem Homeworld. And the more time you spend with it, the more it starts to look like a lot of human systems, just made legible by being alien. The show portrays this without being heavy-handed about it. You understand the system through how characters interact with it, how they've internalized it, how they speak about themselves and others in relation to it. You don't need a lecture about the gemcast system because the gemcast system is visible in everything. It's in the way Pearl flinches when other gems dismiss her as a pearl. It's in the way Amethyst carries her origin like a wound. It's in the way Peridot initially talks about organic life as having no value, because that's what she was told by a society that told her other gems also had different values based on their type. The diamonds are at the top. Below them are various categories of gems with different roles: warriors, technicians, terraformers, servants, and so on. Some gems are single purpose, others have broader functions, but the principle is the same throughout. You are what you were made to be, and what you were made to be is what you are worth. The off colors are, for me, the most philosophically concentrated expression of the show's argument against this. They're a group of gems encountered in Season 5, when Steven and Lars are stranded on Homeworld. They live in the tunnels beneath an abandoned kindergarten, hiding from the forces that would shatter them for being what they are. Rhodonite is a permanent fusion of a pearl and a ruby, two gems from incompatible casts who fell in love and fused and can't stop being fused. She's been told her entire existence that this is wrong, that she is wrong, and she has been hiding underground for an unspecified but clearly substantial period of time, terrified, trying to be invisible. Fluorite is a fusion of 6 gems, a slow-moving, gentle ancient being who speaks in the careful, unhurried way of someone who has been thinking about everything for a very long time. She is multiple people choosing to be one, continuously, over an extended period of time, and the show presents this with no more drama than it presents any other aspect of the characters. She just is. Padparacha is a sapphire whose future vision works backwards. She sees the immediate past with perfect clarity, several seconds after it's happened, and reports it with genuine delight as though it's news. She is not useful by Homeworld's metrics. She is a delight by any other metrics. Lars, the human, rounds out the group. He ends up stranded on Homeworld too, dies briefly, is resurrected by Steven's powers, and becomes something new. Pink-haired, mildly supernatural, oddly suited to life as a fugitive among alien outcasts who've spent years being told they don't fit. He finds his people in a way he couldn't on Earth. The philosophical point the off-colors make just by existing is that Homeworld's definition of defect is a definition constructed by people who have a stake in maintaining a particular kind of order. A Padparacha sapphire isn't less valuable than a regular sapphire. She's different. The system calls her defective because the system has no use for difference. But the system's lack of use for something says more about the system than about the thing. That's an argument with a fairly wide application. Any system that defines human worth through productivity or conformity to a particular standard of appearance, ability, behavior, identity, is making a claim about value that tells you more about the people designing the system than about the people the system is judging. The off-colors are the show's way of making this argument in a form that is very difficult to miss and very easy to feel. And Steven, when he encounters them, treats them with exactly the same instinctive regard he treats everyone with. He doesn't congratulate them for existing despite their differences. He just wants to know them. He is interested in Padparacha's unusual perception. He is moved by Fluorite's slowness and depth. He finds Rhodonite's anxiety relatable. He does the thing he always does, which is to see people as people rather than as categories. Since we're on the topic of how the caste system shapes the show's characters more broadly, and Peridot is the sharpest example of this. She arrives as a character who has completely internalized the homeworld hierarchy. She doesn't question it. She lives inside it, speaks in its terms, evaluates everything by its standards. Organic life has no value because organic life doesn't produce gems or contribute to the gem empire. Fusions between different types are improper. Pearls don't have independent opinions. These aren't positions she's reasoned her way to. They're the water she swims in. Her arc, which we'll come back to, is partly about the disintegration of that internalized hierarchy, when she's forced to actually encounter the things it told her were worthless. Earth has organic life, and she ends up genuinely moved by it. Pearls have opinions, and Pearl's opinions turn out to be interesting and sometimes correct. Amethyst fuses with her, and it's actually quite lovely. The system's claims collapse under the weight of direct experience. That's not an unusual arc for a character to take in fiction. People who have been raised in rigid ideological systems sometimes encounter their first real exceptions and find, to their confusion, that the exceptions don't fit the framework. And then they have a choice: double down on the framework or revise it. The show is consistently interested in the characters who revise it, and it is patient about how slow that revision sometimes is. The show never really asks its characters to forgive Homeworld for what it did. It asks them to understand it and to choose differently, and to build something that isn't built on the same principles. That's a different ask. Understanding is not the same as absolution. White Diamond is the most powerful being in the gem universe. She is enormous, pale, geometric, and has been running the gem empire for a very long time. When she finally appears, properly appears, not just as a distant authority being discussed. She is both terrifying and unexpectedly poignant. There are 4 diamonds: white, yellow, blue, and the absent pink. Each of them is presented as something specific, and the show's treatment of them across the later seasons is one of its most interesting achievements. Yellow Diamond is efficiency and pragmatism and carefully maintained competence. She runs things, she makes decisions based on rational utility. She is dismissive of sentiment and keeps her grief about Pink Diamond locked away behind a performance of absolute control. There's a scene in the season 4 episode That Will Be All, where Yellow Diamond is pressuring Blue Diamond to stop grieving, to get back to the work of running the Empire, and it becomes gradually clear that Yellow Diamond is desperate, not callous. She is trying to manage her own grief by refusing to look at it. And she's doing it by trying to make Blue Diamond stop looking at hers, because Blue Diamond's grief is a mirror, and Yellow Diamond cannot afford to look in it. That scene, which starts as a villain scene and becomes something more human, is quietly devastating. Blue Diamond is grief made architectural. She has been mourning Pink Diamond for 5,000 years, and her mourning radiates outward. Her presence causes everyone nearby to weep uncontrollably. She collects objects and beings associated with Pink Diamond. She has preserved the human zoo where Pink Diamond kept humans she found fascinating. She is the sentimentality and nostalgia of authoritarian power, the face that says it is doing what it does for love of something precious and lost while still doing enormous harm. That combination is not unusual in the real world. It's actually one of the more common faces authoritarianism wears. And then White Diamond. White Diamond is the ideological center of the whole system. She is the one who devised, or at least most fully embodies, the principle that Homeworld operates on. That perfection is possible, that every gem has a correct form and function, that deviation is error rather than difference, and that the role of authority is to maintain and enforce this correctness for the benefit of everyone. Her vision of care is control. Her version of love is homogenization. The moment where this becomes most explicit is in the Change Your Mind special, when White Diamond reveals what she's been doing to the gems who have been corrected, gems who were taken over by her and turned into extensions of herself, blank-faced and identical, all the personality drained away. She believes this is a kindness. She believes the messy, conflicted individual personalities of every gem are sources of pain and error, and that absorbing those personalities into her own is mercy. She is removing their burden of selfhood. Steven's confrontation with White Diamond is one of the show's most philosophically interesting sequences, precisely because it can't be solved through fighting. White Diamond is essentially undefeatable. In physical terms, what Steven does is refuse to be absorbed. He insists, persistently, specifically, on being himself, on being Steven rather than Pink Diamond, and eventually the insistence breaks through something in White Diamond's certainty. She expected Pink Diamond. She got Steven. and Stephen is so thoroughly, specifically, irreducibly himself that her framework for understanding what she's encountering doesn't fit. The show makes a subtle but important point about authority through the Diamond's eventual transformation. They don't become good people overnight. They don't have a sudden enlightenment. What happens is that they are shown over the course of several sustained encounters with Stephen that the things they were protecting, the Empire, the Order, the idea of gem perfection, were costing them their actual relationships. Blue Diamond's grief was real, and the thing she was grieving was real. Yellow Diamond's capability was real. But neither of those things was being allowed to be just what it was, because the system required them to be something more manageable, more useful, more controlled. When the Diamonds begin to change, in the show's final arc, it isn't because Stephen defeats them. It's because he keeps seeing them. He doesn't accept the performance. He talks to what's underneath it. He is, in his persistent, warm, slightly infuriating way, a genuinely curious person who wants to know the person behind the power, and that curiosity is, in the show's universe, actually powerful. The show's argument about authoritarianism, taken as a whole, is something like this. Authoritarian systems are not primarily maintained by people who are evil. They are maintained by people who are afraid, or who are grieving, or who have been told and have accepted that control equals love, that conformity equals safety, that difference is inherently dangerous. That doesn't excuse what those systems do, but it does suggest that the way to change them is not only, or even primarily, through force. It's through the patient, difficult work of reaching the people inside the system and helping them see that their actual needs, the real things underneath the power, are not being served by it. That is an optimistic position, possibly naively optimistic, in a real-world context. But the show holds it clearly and builds it carefully over seasons of storytelling, and I find I don't entirely want to argue with it. There's also something worth noting about how the Diamond's power is specifically visual, specifically about appearance. They demand that gems look a certain way, perform a certain way, embody particular visual signifiers of correctness. The homeworld aesthetic is sharp and angular and monochrome in specific ways that contrast with the softer, more varied colors of Earth. The politics of the show are, quite deliberately, also in aesthetics. The freedom the crystal gems embody is also a freedom of form, of color, of shape. Stephen's aesthetic, warm, rounded, pink, a bit chaotic, is the opposite of White Diamond's. That's not an accident. There's a character I haven't mentioned yet who deserves her own section, because the episode built around her is doing something that doesn't fit easily into the rest of the show's philosophical framework. And the show knows that and leans into it rather than smoothing it over. Bismuth is a crystal gem who was fighting alongside Rose and Pearl and the others in the Gem War, and then, at some point before the war ended, disappeared. The crystal gems assumed she'd been shattered, killed in gem terms. In reality, she'd been bubbled, imprisoned in a stasis sphere, kept dormant, hidden inside Lion's magical mane for over 5,000 years. Stephen discovers her and accidentally releases her, and Bismuth is, in many ways, wonderful. She's a blacksmith, a weapons maker, a builder, who is warm and boisterous and immediately, genuinely fond of Stephen. She makes him a proper weapon. She reconnects with the crystal gems with an emotional intensity that makes sense, given she's been isolated for millennia and suddenly back among people she loves. The episode seems for a while like it's going to be a warm homecoming story. And then she shows Stephen what she was working on, when Rose bubbled her, the breaking point. A weapon specifically designed to shatter other gems. Not just defeat them, shatter them permanently. The gem equivalent of killing. Bismuth's argument is straightforward. Homeworld has been shattering crystal gems throughout the war. The Diamond Authority has the power to shatter. Why should the crystal gems hold back? Why fight a war with one hand tied behind your back against an enemy who has no such scruples? Stephen refuses, and the episode becomes a fight, and the ending is both necessary and genuinely uncomfortable. He bubbles her again. He doesn't shatter her, he doesn't kill her, but he puts her back in stasis, and the episode ends with him grieving for her, for what just happened, for the position he was put in. The discomfort of this episode is philosophically productive, because Bismuth isn't wrong, exactly. The asymmetry she's describing is real. The crystal gems are fighting against an empire that has shattered thousands of gems, that has no moral qualms about lethal force, that is fighting by completely different rules. The tactical argument for the breaking point is coherent. If you're trying to win a war against a vastly superior force and you're losing, the ethical constraints you place on your own conduct are costing you. Steven's refusal is based on something he doesn't fully articulate in the episode, but that the show has been building since the beginning. He doesn't want to win by becoming what they're fighting against. He doesn't believe that the means are separable from the ends. If the crystal gems start shattering gems, they become something different than what they say they are. The victory, if it comes, won't mean what they needed it to mean. That's a real philosophical disagreement, not a case where one side is simply correct. The debate between consequentialists, who would say that outcomes matter more than methods, that winning the war by any means would save more lives, and deontologists, who would say that there are things you simply do not do, regardless of consequences, is one of the oldest and least resolved debates in ethics. The show stages it in a children's cartoon episode and doesn't cheat. Both positions are given their proper weight. The other dimension of the Bismuth episode is what it says about Rose. Bismuth was bubbled by Rose, not by an enemy. Rose made the decision to imprison her own ally without telling anyone else because Bismuth had a vision of the war that Rose couldn't endorse. And instead of having the conversation, Rose made Bismuth disappear. That is, let's be clear, an awful thing to do. It's a betrayal. It is, specifically, a powerful person using that power to make a problem go away, rather than engaging with it honestly. The show adds this to Rose's growing ledger of complicated choices. She wasn't wrong, philosophically, to oppose the breaking point, but she handled her disagreement with Bismuth in a way that was wrong regardless of her philosophical position, because she denied Bismuth the dignity of a real conversation. She used her authority instead of using her words. Bismuth, when she eventually returns in Steven Universe Future, released, given the real explanation Rose never gave her, treated as someone whose feelings about being imprisoned deserve acknowledgement, has to process all of this. Her anger and her grief and her complicated love for the crystal gems all exist at the same time, in the same person, without canceling each other out. The show lets that stand. There is no clean resolution. There are just people trying to be honest with each other about a very long and painful history. Bismuth is also, practically speaking, one of the most purely likable characters in the show. Her enthusiasm is huge, her laugh is good. The episode where she returns in future and starts modernizing Beach City's infrastructure, because she is a builder who needs to build, is genuinely joyful. The show does well by her in the end, even if the path there was hard. She's a reminder that the show's philosophical arguments are not always comfortable, and that it doesn't cheat by making the hard questions easy. The hard questions are hard. The show just doesn't flinch at them. Before we get to Jasper, who deserves her own proper discussion, there's a quieter thread running through the show's treatment of the war that I want to name briefly. The corrupted gems. When the diamonds retreated from Earth at the end of the war, they unleashed a weapon, a burst of energy that damaged every gem on the planet who wasn't shielded. Rose shielded herself and Pearl and Garnet, but every other gem, crystal, and homeworld alike was caught in it. The effect was corruption. Gems lost their sense of self, their cognitive function, their ability to hold their form as the person they were. They became feral, monster-like, driven by instinct without the selfhood that would make them a person. For thousands of years, Steven grows up encountering these corrupted gems as essentially monsters, creatures that attack and need to be bubbled, sealed away until something changes. And then, eventually, something does. When the diamonds combine their power with Steven's and heal the corruption, these gems reform. They become people again. People who have been lost inside themselves for thousands of years, who missed the entire evolution of the world, who come back blinking and bewildered into an era they have no framework for. The show doesn't spend a lot of time on this. The healing happens in the finale and the aftermath isn't fully explored until future. But the premise is haunting in a quiet way. The corrupted gems were, for most of the show, the literal monsters. The things Steven fought in every episode of the week format. And then we learned they were always people. Always people. Just buried. That says something about how the show thinks about monstrousness and personhood. Something being dangerous doesn't make it not a person. The two things can coexist. Harm can come from beings who are also suffering, who are also lost, who are also worth reaching if you have the means to reach them. It's a gentle point, and the show makes it gently. Jasper is introduced as the most powerful warrior the crystal gems have encountered in the present day. A commanding, contemptuous, physically formidable Quartz, who arrived on Earth alongside Peridot, with exactly no interest in anything Steven has to say. She's the show's most direct antagonist for the second half of Season 1, and recurs throughout the series, always as a source of threat and disruption. But Jasper is also, and this takes a while to fully emerge, one of the show's most philosophically interesting characters, because Jasper is what happens when someone takes the homeworld value system absolutely seriously and builds their entire identity around it without reservation. She is the ideal homeworld product, perfect by homeworld standards, skilled at exactly what she was made for, deeply invested in the hierarchy and her position within it. She is proud of what she is in a way that looks, from a distance, like confidence. But there is something in Jasper that is more brittle than it appears. Her specific wound is Earth. She was made in the prime kindergarten, the same kindergarten as Amethyst, during the Crystal Gem War. Her quartz batch was meant to serve Pink Diamond's colony. The colony was taken from Pink Diamond before it was finished. The war disrupted everything, and Jasper grew up in the ruins of an incomplete colonization. She came out perfect, but she came out into a situation that had already gone wrong before she arrived. She has been, for her entire existence, someone who was made for a purpose that circumstances denied her. And then she meets Amethyst, who came from the same place, who is everything Jasper is supposed to be, but smaller, later, different. Amethyst is, from Jasper's perspective, the embodiment of what Earth did wrong, a defective product of a failed colony. And yet Amethyst is walking around, fighting, existing without apology. Jasper finds this genuinely offensive, not as a performance of disdain, but as an actual affront to the order she believes in. If Amethyst can just be without consequence, then the standards that make Jasper exceptional mean less. There's something sad in this that the show gradually lets you see. Jasper's contempt for Amethyst is, underneath it, a kind of envy of Amethyst's freedom. Amethyst is not carrying the weight of being exactly what she was supposed to be. She was never that thing, and has mostly made her peace with it. Jasper has spent her entire existence being the thing she was supposed to be, and finding that it doesn't give her what she needed. The show's most uncomfortable Jasper material comes in the later seasons, when she appears periodically, still fighting, still refusing to be persuaded by anything Steven says, still absolutely committed to the homeworld worldview, even as that world has changed around her. There's an episode, Earthlings, where Amethyst and Steven fight her together, and the emotional stakes of the fight are not about power, but about recognition. Steven keeps trying to reach Jasper. She keeps refusing. She tells him, plainly, that she doesn't want what he's offering. That his version of the story, that she could change, that she could choose differently, that her life could be otherwise, is not the story she's in. That's a remarkable thing for a children's show to allow its villain to say. Because Jasper isn't wrong that Steven is trying to rewrite her. He is. He believes with full sincerity that people can choose differently than they have, that no one is beyond the possibility of change. Jasper's response is to say, "That's your philosophy, not mine. I don't want your redemption. I know who I am. Leave me alone." The show doesn't know what to do with that entirely, and the Jasper plotline is one of the less resolved threads by the end of the main series. In future, Steven eventually encounters Jasper again, living alone on an island, still training, still refusing to change. The confrontation they finally have is one of the most emotionally complex things in Future. Jasper tells Steven the truth about how she sees him, that he is Pink Diamond's son, that he carries Pink Diamond's power, that his soft approach is a performance. She fights him to prove it. And she does prove something, in a way that's uncomfortable for both of them. Steven, in Future, is not fully well. He has power he's struggling to control. Anger he hasn't fully faced. A capacity for force that his identity as a compassionate person doesn't have room for. Jasper pushes him and he becomes, briefly, more like what she said he was. The show doesn't frame this as Jasper being right, but it does let Jasper's challenge surface something real. Her eventual, tentative, partial movement, not a full redemption arc, really more of a crack in the absolute certainty she'd been carrying, feels earned precisely because the show never pretended she was secretly waiting to be saved. She's been the thing she is, fully and completely, for the entire time. The change that starts is small and isn't completed on screen. The show is too honest to give her a clean ending. Jasper is the show's argument about what happens when identity is built entirely on being perfect within a system, and the system loses. When the thing you built yourself to be turns out to have been in service of something that was wrong, something that has now been dismantled, and the dismantling hasn't given you back the years you spent. There's no good answer available to Jasper by the end. The show doesn't pretend there is. It just follows her with an honesty that's its own form of respect. Lapis is the character I think the show is most honest about, in terms of what trauma actually does to a person over time. Let me trace her history because it matters for understanding where she ends up. Lapis Lazuli was a terraformer, a gem whose function was to reshape the surface of planets to make them suitable for colonization. She came to Earth during the colony process and was caught in the crossfire of the rebellion. In the confusion, she was mistaken for a crystal gem by a homeworld soldier and imprisoned in a mirror, literally sealed inside a piece of reflective glass, conscious and aware, but unable to communicate or interact with the world around her. She was used as a repository for information, something that could show images and replay scenes without anyone understanding that she was inside it. She was in the mirror for thousands of years. That is the foundational fact of Lapis's character, and the show is not casual about what it means. Thousands of years of imprisonment, of awareness without agency, of being used as a tool by people who didn't know she was a person. When Steven eventually frees her, in a genuinely lovely moment in Season 1 where he realizes she's in there and just talks to her, she has been through something that cannot be fully undone by freedom alone. After the mirror, she's captured by Homeworld, corrupted, made into a vehicle for a corrupted form of ocean manipulation, then freed again. Then there's the Malachite situation with Jasper, which we talked about in the fusion section. Months at the bottom of the ocean, keeping Jasper contained by trapping them both. Then she's freed from that. Then she's slowly, tentatively, building something like a life on Earth with Peridot, in a barn in the middle of nowhere, which is about as far from the gem hierarchy as you can get. And here's the thing about Lapis in the barn era. She's not better. She's free, and she's safe, and she has someone who genuinely cares about her, and she is not better. She uses apathy as insulation. She detaches. She waits for the next bad thing because the next bad thing has always come, and she cannot quite believe that this time it won't. There's a moment where Peridot's obvious enthusiasm for their life together, the way Peridot is genuinely delighted by Earth, by their meat morphs, by having a friend, almost gets through to Lapis, and then it doesn't, and you can see the moment when she retreats again. The retreat is a decision. It is also not a choice, exactly. It is what her nervous system has learned to do. The show is careful not to frame Lapis's difficulty as ingratitude or as a flaw in the sense of something she's doing wrong. It's depicted as the logical, understandable consequence of a very long history of harm. You don't get to decide, through willpower, to stop anticipating danger when danger has been reliably present for thousands of years. The body remembers what the mind tries to move past. Alone at Sea, the episode where Jasper reappears and tries to convince Lapis to refuse with her, is one of the most uncomfortable episodes in the show. in a productive way. What Jasper describes as the experience of malachite is the show's most direct engagement with how abusive relationships can feel significant to both parties. Jasper isn't lying when she says she felt powerful in that fusion. She is also not wrong when she says it was the most intense relationship she's ever had. But intensity and health are not the same thing, and the show holds that distinction clearly. Lapis's refusal is appropriate and hard-won. The fact that she's visibly shaken by the encounter after it is also appropriate and honest. Lapis doesn't have an arc that resolves exactly. She doesn't arrive at healing. She makes some choices that are good for her and some that aren't. In the late seasons, before the final battle, she simply leaves. She takes the barn and she goes. Because she has done this before, been at the center of a catastrophic conflict that destroyed her, and she cannot do it again. The show doesn't condemn this. Peridot is hurt by it. Stephen is hurt by it. But the show doesn't make Lapis a villain for self-preservation. It just shows the cost of her absence and the reasons for it, and leaves you to hold both. There's something important in the show refusing to give Lapis a neat arc. Some of its characters do get to arrive at better places, visibly and clearly. Amethyst, Peridot, even the diamonds in their complicated way. But Lapis remains suspended in something that is better than it was, and not yet what healing would look like if healing were fully available to her. That's realistic. That's what protracted trauma actually looks like in a lot of people. The show acknowledging that, not making her suffer pointlessly, but also not wrapping her damage in a bow, is, I think, an act of respect toward the experience it's depicting. Now, talking a bit about the specific detail of Lapis's relationship with Peridot, which is one of the show's warmest and gentlest things even amid all of this. Peridot is relentlessly positive about her situation, in a way that is partly naivety and partly a different kind of coping mechanism. She is enthusiastic about Earth because she has decided to be enthusiastic about Earth, having previously been contemptuous of it. That enthusiasm is real even if it's also constructed, and it is, quietly, a lifeline for Lapis. Not because it fixes anything, but because it is something warm and consistent to be near. Peridot is not frightened of Lapis's difficulty. She just keeps being herself, which includes being fond of Lapis, and that constancy has a value the show doesn't need to announce. It just shows it. The barn, with its mess of half-finished sculptures and Peridot's carefully maintained tablet, and the odd warmth of two people learning to coexist, is one of my favorite settings in the whole show. It feels genuinely lived in a way that speaks well of the animators and writers who created it. It feels like a place people actually are. Peridot is introduced as a small, slightly frantic, deeply competent gem technician from Homeworld who arrives on Earth in a robotic suit to check on the status of the cluster, a planet-destroying gem weapon buried in the Earth's core, and immediately starts having a worse time than she was expecting. She's the antagonist for the second half of Season 2, and then a reluctant ally, and then an actual ally, and then a member of the Crystal Gems. And by the later season, she's someone who makes little sculptures out of scraps and has passionate opinions about a television show about a family of camp counselors, and is demonstrably, recognizably happy in a way she was not at the beginning. Her journey is the show's most comedic philosophical arc, which is part of why it works so well. The comedy gives you permission to enjoy the character before you've fully understood what's happening to her. By the time you realize you've been watching her become a person, you already care about the person she's become. Peridot arrives with all of Homeworld's values fully installed. Organic life is primitive and irrelevant. Pearls are servants. Fusions between different types are undignified. Gems have functions, and those functions determine their worth. She says these things flatly, without malice, because they are simply true to her. Facts about the universe rather than opinions she has developed. That's an important distinction. The most insidious aspect of internalized ideology is that it doesn't feel like ideology. It feels like obvious fact. Her first real crack comes from necessity. She's stranded on Earth, separated from her robotic limb enhancers, reduced to a form she considers humiliatingly small, and she has to interact with the crystal gems to survive. The crystal gems are patient with her in a way that is partly Stephen's influence and partly genuine gem pragmatism. She's useful in her way. She's allowed to be difficult while being useful. The episode, she'll argue back. She's argumentative by nature. But when she encounters organic life and finds it interesting, when she starts watching Camp Pining Hearts, the Canadian drama about camp counselors, and becomes emotionally invested in the characters, something is shifting underneath the ideology. She's finding that things she was told had no value are actually, to her, valuable. Her own experience is contradicting her beliefs, and eventually she has to choose which one to trust. The Camp Pining Hearts subplot is genuinely charming, and I don't want to undersell it as a bit of characterization. Peridot becomes obsessed with the show, develops strong opinions about the relationships between the characters, writes essays about it in what she calls a log that is absolutely a diary. Her concept of meep morse, her word for art before she has the word, is, I think, the show's gentlest and most precise depiction of what art is for. She starts making things, small sculptures from junk, abstract and strange that she has no cultural framework to understand. She doesn't know why she's making them, just that she is, and that the making feels like something. When she shows them to Stephen and he calls them art, her reaction is interesting. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Someone has named the category the activity belongs to. The argument the show makes through Peridot is that the capacity for creativity, for aesthetic experience, for finding meaning in made things, is something that exists regardless of whether your particular cultural framework has a category for it. She was always going to make meep morphs. She had to be somewhere long enough and safe enough to discover that about herself. By the time Peridot becomes a full crystal gem, the change in her has been so gradual and so grounded in specific experiences that it doesn't feel like a conversion. It feels like a person discovering who they are, under the layers of what they were told to be. She's still abrasive, still prone to long-winded explanations of things everyone already understands, still deeply, somewhat inflexibly certain about things she's decided she's certain about. But the things she's certain about are now, for the most part, her own, position she's arrived at through encounter and experience rather than inherited from a system that had nothing but contempt for her. Since we're on the topic of Peridot's relationship with Earth and organic life, there's one more thread here that deserves a moment. The cluster. The cluster is a weapon buried in the Earth's core, a mass of corrupted gem shards, forced together against their will, destined to form an enormous fusion and destroy the planet. The episode in which Stephen and Peridot communicate with the cluster, trying to help it form a stable bubble around itself to prevent the explosion, is quietly remarkable. The cluster is not really a character. It's an aggregate of suffering, a collection of shards of consciousness that have been crammed together and are in enormous distress, but Stephen treats it as someone. He talks to it with the same attentiveness he brings to every being he encounters, and Peridot, who starts the episode as someone who would categorize the cluster as a weapon rather than as a being, ends it as someone who can see it differently. Something changed in her during that conversation. She plants a meep morp at the drill site after, a small act of acknowledgement of something that mattered. Rebecca Sugar was a musician before she was a television creator. She wrote songs for Adventure Time, including I Remember You, which is one of the saddest things ever broadcast to children. And she comes at storytelling with an understanding that certain emotional truths are only fully accessible through music. Not as decoration, not as punctuation, as the place where the real thing lives. Steven Universe has a lot of songs, not in a saturated musical episode way, but steadily, persistently, across the entire run of the show. Some of them are silly. The Cookie Cat rap at the beginning, the Fry song, various ditties that exist mainly to be pleasant. But quite a few of them are doing something more significant, and the ones that are doing something significant tend to land with a particular force. Let me talk about a handful of them, because the music is genuinely part of the show's philosophy rather than an accompaniment to it. Stronger Than You is the first of the show's real songs, in the sense of a song that carries philosophical weight rather than just charm. It's Garnet's battle song, performed during the Season 1 finale, addressed to Jasper. The core of it is an assertion, I am made of love, I exist. Here Comes a Thought is the other song I want to spend some time with, because I think it's the one that has had the most tangible effect on people outside the show. It's from the Season 4 episode Mindful Education, and it functions as a guided practice in what's sometimes loosely described as cognitive diffusion. The idea that you don't have to be your thoughts, that you can observe them arriving rather than being swept away by them. The song was written in collaboration with Jeff Liu and Ben Levin, and Rebecca Sugar has cited mindfulness practices as an influence on it. Garnet and Stevani float in a white space and sing about how thoughts that feel overwhelming are smaller than they seem when you see them whole rather than being consumed by them. It is a remarkably direct and accurate piece of writing about what anxiety actually does and how you can start to work with it rather than against it. And it's in a children's cartoon, sung by Geometric Alien Fusions. Beautifully animated, a lot of people have found it genuinely helpful as a grounding tool, not just as something they enjoyed watching. That's unusual for fiction. Most fiction that deals with mental health either dramatizes it for narrative purposes or talks about it in an informational way. This song tries to actually model something useful. It's Over, Isn't It? Pearl's song from Mr. Greg is a portrait of grief at its most sophisticated. It's not about sadness exactly. It's about the specific feeling of watching something you loved choose something else, of understanding the choice while still being unable to stop feeling it. The song is musically a ballad, but lyrically quite precise. And the precision is part of what makes it hit. It doesn't reach for easy sentiment. It just describes the thing as clearly as it can. Pearl's voice actor, Dee Dee Magno Hall, performs it with a quality of restraint that makes the emotion hit harder rather than softer. Change Your Mind is the finale song of the special of the same name, and it's attempting something ambitious, to hold the whole show's philosophy in a single melody. It's Steven singing to the diamonds, to the gems, to everyone who has been told who they are and what they're worth by a system that had no right to define them. The title phrase has a double meaning: change your mind as a request to reconsider, and change your mind as a description of what's possible for consciousness, what it means to be a thinking being that can choose differently than it has been. It's not the tightest song Sugar has written. It's reaching slightly. But the reach itself is part of the point. The overall sonic world of the show is worth noting as a separate thing from the song specifically. The score, composed by Ivy Tran and Stephen Lacey, later just Ivy and Sarashu, uses a palette of synthesizers and acoustic instruments that create something warm and slightly otherworldly. The beach city sequences have a specific quality of seaside warmth. The homeworld sequences have a cooler, harder sound that matches the aesthetic. Music is doing characterization work throughout, not just in the songs but in the underscore. And since we're on the topic of the show's aesthetic relationship to sound, silence is used well too. The show doesn't fill every moment. There are sequences that breathe, that let you sit with what just happened before the next thing happens. Sleep content audiences are probably already familiar with the feeling of a piece of media that doesn't rush you. Steven Universe is good at that in its non-action sequences. It has the quality of knowing when to stop talking. Music in the show is, ultimately, the place where the show says the things that are hardest to say in dialogue. Dialogue can explain and describe and argue. Music can put you in the feeling of something, hold you in it, move you through it. The show uses this understanding deliberately, and the results, when they work, are extraordinary. There's a version of Steven Universe that could have been purely about the Gem War and its aftermath, about the mythology, the lore, the grand philosophical stakes. That show would probably still be good, but the reason this particular show is great, I think, is Beach City. Beach City is a small, slightly faded seaside town. It has a boardwalk, a fry shop, a few houses that lean at slightly implausible angles, a community that knows everyone's business, a car wash. It is, In the visual language of the show, drawn with the same soft warmth as everything else, but with a human scale specificity that anchors the whole thing. When Stephen is at the Crystal Temple with the gems, the stakes feel vast and ancient. When he's the big donut talking to Lars, the stakes are, will Lars acknowledge his feelings for Sadie? These are not the same scale of stakes. The show treats them with the same attention. The human characters are not incidental. Greg Universe, Stephen's dad, is one of the best written parents in the children's animation. He's a bit of a failure, by the metrics of contemporary adult life. He lives in his van. He had a music career that peaked once and never recovered. He clearly didn't know what he was doing when he found himself raising a child who had magical alien powers. But he loves Stephen so thoroughly and so plainly, without condition, without agenda, without using that love to ask anything of Stephen in return, that he's a kind of counterpoint to almost every other parental figure in the show. Gem parenting, such as it is, tends to be about function. The Crystal Gems love Stephen genuinely and deeply, but their care for him has historically been entangled with their sense of duty to Rose's legacy, to protecting Earth, to making sure he develops his powers. Greg's love is simpler than that. He just wants Stephen to be alright and to feel loved. He plays guitar. He tells him stories about his mom. He's there. That's enough. The episode Full Disclosure has a line from Greg that I find quite memorable. He tells Stephen that he doesn't need to share everything with him, that Stephen is allowed to have things that are his own, that Greg trusts him. It's a small exchange. It establishes something important about their relationship and about Greg's philosophy of parenting. He is not trying to manage Stephen, he is just trying to know him. Connie is equally important in a different way. She's Stephen's best friend, his adventure partner, and eventually his girlfriend, in the understated way that the show handles romantic feelings among its main characters. Connie's arc is about learning to assert herself, to have opinions and preferences and desires that aren't simply shaped by what other people need from her. She spends a portion of the show being so in service of Stephen that she loses track of her own story. The show catches this and addresses it. In Season 5, Connie makes a choice to step back from Stephen's life for a while, because she recognizes she's been disappearing into his world rather than building her own. That's a sophisticated thing to show in a children's program. The idea that love, friendship, romance, any of it, can involve too much self-erasure, and that recognizing that and choosing differently is not rejection, but care. The show handled their reunion after the separation with the same warmth it handles everything, and their relationship at the end of the series is more genuinely equal than it was before the separation. The other Beach City residents, the Fryman family who run the fry shop, the Maheshwarans who are Connie's parents, Lars and Sadie, Ronaldo who runs a paranormal blog, with an extremely partial grasp on the reality around him, are present to do a specific kind of work. They are the people whose world the Gems and Stephen are fighting to protect. When the show grounds you in Beach City, it's giving you the stakes in human form. It's not abstract. The continuity of life in this small town, the specific textures of it, are what the show is arguing for. Life this particular. Life this small and specific and irreplaceable. Lars's arc across the show is one of the slower and more patient ones. He starts as the slightly prickly, self-conscious teenager at the Big Donut, who makes Stephen's life mildly difficult for reasons that are more about his own insecurity than anything else. He ends up through a series of events that include death, resurrection, and spending time as a fugitive among the off-colors in space, as someone with more genuine courage than he knew he had. The show is careful not to make his growth triumphant or linear. He doesn't suddenly become confident. He becomes slowly someone who can act despite the absence of confidence. That's different, arguably more valuable. Sadie is one of the most underused characters in the show and also one of the most quietly real. She has talent that gets suppressed, a voice, a personality, an ability to be present in her own life, that the show keeps almost surfacing and then leaving for later. Her arc in the later seasons, when she forms a band, feels like the show finally letting her have the space she deserved. The point of Beach City, philosophically, is that a full life is made of small things. The grand arguments about identity and freedom and what it means to belong to yourself are important. But so is the fry shop. So is the knowledge of what your friends are going through. So is the specific quality of light on a boardwalk in the early evening. The show refuses to rank these scales of experience against each other, and I think that refusal is one of its most considered philosophical positions. Nothing in Beach City is too small to matter. Everything is worth its specific weight. Steven Universe Future asks a question that most stories don't get around to. What happens to the hero after the story's over? The main series ends well. The war is resolved. The diamonds have changed. The corrupted gems who were caught in a blast of diamond energy during the war and lost their forms, becoming feral creatures, are healed. The crystal system of oppression that had been in place for thousands of years is dismantled. The gems of Earth are safe. Steven gets to go to prom, sort of. It is, by any reasonable measure, a happy ending. And then Steven Universe Future starts, and it's immediately clear that the person who saved the world is not doing well. The Epilogue series, which ran from 2019 to 2020, is structured as a series of episodes that look, initially, like standalone stories about the new era, gems adjusting to life post-war, the little homeschool that Steven has set up to help gems integrate with Earth, the new relationships being built. But running underneath all of these episodes is a sustained examination of Steven's mental health, which is deteriorating in ways he doesn't recognize and won't talk about. The show gradually reveals what's happening. Steven is experiencing PTSD, triggered by the accumulated weight of every traumatic thing he's been through since he was very young. He had his first life-threatening experience at age 11 or 12. By the time the war ends, he's been abducted multiple times, has died and been resurrected, has faced world-ending threats, has been forced to process enormous grief and complexity about his mother, has spent years being primarily responsible, emotionally and sometimes physically, for people who needed more support than he could fully give. The show's protagonist has been having a childhood that was not a childhood. The PTSD manifests in the show's visual language as uncontrolled power. Steven starts glowing pink when stressed. He has moments where his powers activate without his volition, in ways that can hurt people around him. His body is treating every emotional stressor as though it's a life-threatening emergency, because for a significant portion of his life, it has been, Dr. Maheswaran, Connie's mother, a physician, names what's happening in the episode Growing Pains, in a scene that is fairly direct about what adverse childhood experiences are, and what they do to developing bodies and minds. The episode is quite brave for a children's show. It treats the medical concept with genuine accuracy rather than as a storytelling convenience. Dr. Maheswaran talks to Steven about what his experiences would have done to his body's threat response system. She uses real language, and Steven, hearing this, is simultaneously relieved. There's a name for it. It's something that happens. He's not broken. And terrified, because naming it makes it real in a way that's harder to avoid. Rebecca Sugar has spoken about the personal dimension of future in some detail. She drew on her own experience of trauma and its aftermath, including experiences she had in her early 20s. The book The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, which explores the long-term effects of childhood adversity on physical health, was a significant influence on how the show depicted what was happening to Steven. The specificity of the depiction comes from this. It's not impressionistic. It's grounded in actual understanding of what these experiences do. What Steven is also grappling with, more broadly, is an identity crisis that the happy ending made more visible rather than less. His identity, for his entire childhood, was built around being needed, being the person who could help, being Rose's son, with all the weight that carried, and then being the person who could redeem Rose's mistakes by being better than she was. When the war is over and everyone is safe and healing, that structure dissolves. He doesn't have a role anymore, in the way he did. He doesn't know what he is when he's not saving someone. There's a particular episode, Together Forever, where he proposes to Connie. He is 16. The proposal is not presented as sweet, it's presented as a symptom, an attempt to lock down a relationship that feels foundational, to prevent the loss of Connie to her own expanding life and future. Connie's response is kind and clear. She doesn't say no to Stephen, she says no to the specific thing the proposal was really asking for, which was for her to stay still while Stephen figures out how to exist. She chooses to help him instead, by being honest about what she sees. The final arc of Future is Stephen's breakdown, and the beginning of his recovery. He loses control of his powers completely. He becomes something enormous and pink and terrifying, and the people who love him have to reach through that to find him. What brings him back is not a fight, it is, as it almost always is with Stephen, someone telling him they see him. Greg, in particular, his dad, who just loves him. And then Stephen does something he's never really done. He asks for help, he goes to therapy, he says out loud that he doesn't know what he needs, but he knows he needs something. The finale is not triumphant, it's genuinely quite tender and a little sad. Stephen leaving Beach City for a road trip to figure out who he is outside of his role, with everyone he loves gathered to say goodbye. He doesn't have a plan, he doesn't have a destination, he has a decision to take care of himself. The show ends essentially by saying, survival is not the same as recovery, and recovery is not a destination. It's an ongoing practice. It requires help and naming what's happening, and the radical act of believing that your own well-being matters as much as anyone else's. That is not a small thing to say. In a show that had always argued that care for others is a form of power, Future completes the argument by saying, care for yourself is also a form of power. That the hero who spent his whole childhood giving doesn't stop being a hero when he starts receiving. That asking for help is not weakness. That you don't have to earn the right to be looked after. I find Future genuinely moving, more than any other part of the show. Not because it's the most dramatically ambitious, but because it feels the most honest about what the accumulated weight of a life actually does to a person, and what the beginning of dealing with that honestly looks like. Something I want to say directly because I think it deserves to be said clearly. Steven Universe is an optimistic show. Not naively, not cheaply, not in the way that optimism is sometimes used in children's media to paper over complications, but genuinely, structurally, philosophically optimistic. It believes that people can change. It believes that understanding is more powerful than force. It believes that harm can be addressed and that the people who caused it can come to a different relationship with what they did. I think it's worth examining that as a philosophical position, because optimism gets a bad reputation in a certain kind of serious intellectual culture. The assumption tends to be that the bleaker your assessment of human nature and human possibility, the more honestly you're engaging with reality. The assumption is that optimism is a kind of naivety, a refusal to look at things clearly. Steven Universe disagrees with this, and I think its disagreement is worth taking seriously. The show's optimism is not based on the claim that people are good by nature, or that things always work out, or that harm doesn't have lasting consequences. The show is quite clear on all of these points. People are shaped by their histories and their systems and their wounds. Things often don't work out, and when they do, the working out frequently costs more than expected. Harm has lasting consequences that don't disappear when the person who caused the harm changes. All of this is acknowledged throughout. What the show argues is something more specific, that the capacity for change exists in almost everyone, and that creating the conditions in which that capacity can express itself, treating someone as though their change is possible, engaging with the person rather than the function or the role or the record is itself a form of power, not a guarantee, not a magic solution, but a genuine force in the world. The ethics of care framework we talked about early on, the idea that genuine attentiveness to a specific person, rather than the application of abstract rules, is itself a moral act, is actually the undergirding of this argument. Treating someone as though their change is possible creates possibilities that aren't otherwise available. Not guarantees, possibilities. Stephen's approach to his enemies, which the show vindicates most of the time, is a dramatization of exactly this. He treats everyone as someone who might be reached, and often enough, they are. The counterexample, the show's own doubt about this position, is represented partly by Jasper, who we just talked about, and partly by certain events in Future, where Stephen's compulsive helpfulness is shown to be unsustainable, where the optimism about other people is deployed at the cost of his own well-being. The show doesn't simply celebrate the optimism. It asks what it costs the person who carries it, and whether that cost is equitably distributed. But the fundamental stance remains. By the end of Future, after the breakdown and the therapy and the road trip and the beginning of recovery, the show's position is something like, the world is difficult and people are complicated, and harm is real, and also, in spite of all of this, things can be better than they are. Not because of magic, because of choices made over time by people who are trying. That's the thing that's being argued for across the full run of this show. And I find, when I think about it, that I want to agree with it. One thing that helps the show's optimism feel earned rather than cheap is that it doesn't distribute hope evenly. Not every character gets a redemption arc. Not every antagonist is reached. Jasper, as we talked about, only cracks slightly, and the crack is ambiguous. Lapis doesn't arrive at healing on the show's schedule. Some of the corrupted gems who are healed at the end are going to spend a very long time processing what happened to them. The show is honest about these limitations while still holding the overall position that things can improve. That's a meaningful distinction. Cheap optimism says everything works out. Earned optimism says things can work out, often do, sometimes don't, and the trying matters regardless. Steven Universe is emphatically in the earned column. It has looked at its own argument from multiple angles and stress tested it, and the argument holds mostly with the kinds of asterisks that make it truer rather than less. I think this is also why the show ages well, or at least why I find it ages well. Easy optimism in fiction has a short shelf life. You return to it, and it feels naive in ways you didn't notice when you were younger. Complicated optimism that has thought about its counter-arguments and included them, holds up. It was already asking the hard questions. It didn't need to pretend they weren't there. That wanting is itself a kind of philosophical position. Optimism as a choice rather than a conclusion. A decision about how to orient yourself toward the uncertain future, made in full awareness that the uncertainty is real. The show makes that choice and lives in it and tries to show you what it looks like from the inside. I think that's a gift, actually, one worth returning to. Before we close, I want to spend a few minutes on some things that didn't fit elsewhere but that feel like they belong somewhere in this conversation. Loose threads, basically. Bits of the show that are part of what makes it the particular show it is. The Steven Universe movie, titled simply Steven Universe the Movie, was released in 2019 between the main series finale and Future. It introduces a new character called Spinel, who is one of the show's most affecting creations. Spinel was Pink Diamond's childhood companion, a gem made to be a playmate, cheerful, acrobatic, devoted. When Pink Diamond chose to become Rose Quartz and start the rebellion, she told Spinel to wait for her in a garden on Homeworld. Spinel waited for 6,000 years, unmoving, obedient, certain that Pink Diamond would return. She didn't return. Spinel eventually found out why, through a recorded message that told her the truth, and arrived on Earth to destroy it. The movie is primarily a musical, and Spinel's introductory song is one of the most startling pieces of animation the show ever produced. She is a cartoon in the most elastic, anarchic sense, movement that violates physical logic, color that shifts with her emotional state. A performance that bounces between comedy and horror. And what she represents is something very specific. Abandoned love that turned to rage. The particular devastation of someone who gave their entire selfhood to a relationship, and was then, without explanation, simply forgotten. She's not a villain in the traditional sense. though she does enormous harm. She's an accumulation of grief that was never held by anyone. Stephen, characteristically, holds it. The movie's ending is not a permanent resolution of Spinell's pain. She goes off with the reformed diamonds, who have their own reasons to feel responsibility toward her. But it is a beginning of something. The movie also has a device called the Rejuvenator, a weapon that resets gems to their factory settings, erasing everything they've developed, everything they've learned, everything they are except their base function. The crystal gems are reset and Stephen has to help them find themselves again. The question of what remains when everything acquired through experience is stripped away is philosophically direct. Is identity located in accumulated experience or in something prior to it? The show's answer, via Stephen's work to restore each gem, is that identity is both. There's a core, but the core has to be cultivated through relationship and experience to be fully itself. You are not only what you were made to be, but you are. Somewhere in there. Something. And since we're on the topic of the movie, its music is genuinely remarkable. Happily Ever After is the opening number, a deliberately misleading celebration that turns complicated. Disobedient is Spinell's introduction. Other Friends is her initial confrontation with the crystal gems and is one of the most effective villain songs in recent animated film. The whole musical vocabulary of the show is deployed at feature film scale, and the result is, I think, genuinely impressive. There's also the matter of Lion, who I should have mentioned earlier and forgot. Lion is Stephen's pet, a pink lion with a magical mane that contains a pocket dimension where Rose stored things she wanted to keep. He appears early and is immediately beloved, and the show is very patient about revealing what he actually is. He was a regular lion, apparently, whom Rose loved and who died, and she brought him back. The way she brought him back is connected to how Stephen is later brought back after a specific event in future. Lion is a beautiful and slightly mysterious presence throughout the show, serving as a living link to Rose's history. And the episode Lion 3, Straight to Video, where Stephen watches a video message Rose recorded for him before his birth, is one of the quietest and most genuinely moving episodes of the whole series. The message Rose records for Stephen is not what he expected, and is not entirely comforting. She tells him she gave up everything to create him, and that she cannot wait to see what he becomes, and that she wanted him to know that every experience of being alive is extraordinary, even when it doesn't feel like it. It is a loving message. It is also, in retrospect, the words of someone who is not quite fully accounting for what she is asking of the child she is creating. She is giving Stephen permission to exist while also, implicitly, burdening him with the expectation that he will treasure that existence in ways she wasn't always able to demonstrate herself. The show lets both of these things be true simultaneously. None of this needs to be resolved tonight. It's just there, in the show, to sit with. Actually, let's slow right down for a moment, because there's something I've been circling around without quite landing on, and it's probably the simplest thing in this whole video. Something that isn't philosophical in the way most of what we've covered has been philosophical. More observational, I suppose. There are a lot of quiet moments in Steven Universe. Moments where the show isn't making an argument, or building toward a revelation, or doing anything except being present in a specific feeling. The scene in Lion 3, Straight to Video, where Stephen sits on Lion's head, eating cereal and watching the sun come up over the ocean. The montage sequences in the barn, with Peridot and Lapis that are mostly just the two of them existing alongside each other, doing small things. The late season episodes where Stephen and Connie sit in comfortable silence, having arrived at the kind of friendship where silence is its own form of communication. These moments are easy to overlook when you're thinking analytically about what the show is doing. They don't advance the plot, they don't develop the philosophy, they just are. But I think they're actually part of the argument the show is making, in the way that the texture of a piece of fiction can be part of its argument. The show slows down to show you these moments because it believes these moments matter. A person sitting on a magical lion watching the sea in the early morning. Two friends who have been through enormous things just being near each other. the specific quality of doing nothing meaningful in a comfortable place with someone you trust. These are the things the show says are worth protecting, not in a grand speech. Just by showing them with the same attention and care, it shows everything else. There's an episode called Alone Together, which is the Stevani episode, and it has this passage where Stevani is at a beach party and someone is being odd and intrusive about them, and they just step away from it. They walk to the edge of the crowd and they stand by themselves for a moment, feeling the night air, and the show just lets that moment last. No music swelling, no narrative purpose, just a character standing in the quiet and the camera being with them in it. I think about that image a fair amount. Not because it's the show's most dramatic or philosophically dense moment, the opposite. Because it understands that sometimes a character just needs to stand somewhere and breathe. And sometimes what a piece of fiction can offer is exactly that. Not resolution, not revelation, just a moment that holds still long enough for you to be in it. Steven Universe does this deliberately and repeatedly. It knows that pace itself is a form of care, that not rushing, not filling every second with significance is a way of telling the viewer, you don't have to be anywhere else right now. There's no test. There's nothing you're missing. Just this. I find that quality genuinely restful, in the best sense of the word. Not rest as absence, but rest as presence, being somewhere comfortable enough that you can stop racing. The show is good at that. It creates spaces where it's fine to just be in them. And there's something appropriate about all of this as a thing to listen to while falling asleep, I think. The show has that quality, the warmth and the slow pace and the genuine interest in small things that makes it comfortable to be near. You can let it wash over you. You can fall asleep during the part about the homeworld caste system or the ethics of fusion and wake up in the middle of the music section and it will be fine. The show's philosophy doesn't require you to have caught every argument. Some of it will have settled in anyway, the way things do when you're in a state somewhere between listening and not listening. The world the show imagines, Beach City and the Crystal Temple and the soft magic of a planet worth protecting, is a good world to spend some time in when the one outside is less comfortable. That's what the best fiction does. It gives you somewhere to be for a while that isn't here, or it gives you the thing here more clearly than you usually see it, or it does both at once, which is the hardest and best trick. Steven Universe does both. I think it does them beautifully. I want to spend a moment at the end of all this just sitting with what Steven Universe is. It's a show about a boy who loves his family, who tries to understand the people who hurt him rather than just being hurt by them, who is made of something complicated and carries that complication with a kind of everyday grace that is genuinely extraordinary when you stop to look at it. It's a show about 3 alien warriors who have been carrying grief for so long it's become structural, and about the slow work of setting some of it down. It's a show about a caste system that told everyone what they were worth before they had a chance to find out for themselves, and about the possibility of dismantling that, not quickly or cleanly, but really. It's a show about music and about the way certain things can only be said in a particular key, about a small town that is worth fighting for precisely because it is small, about a mother who was magnificent and also deeply flawed, and the impossibility of inheriting someone else's legacy without first separating yourself from it. About fusion, the messy, beautiful, complicated fact of what we become when we let someone else close enough to change us. And it's a show about what happens after the battle and the resolution and the ostensible end of things. About the long, unglamorous work of recovery. About learning that the story doesn't end when the crisis does. About a boy sitting in a car with his dad, or on the steps of the little homeschool, or alone for the first time in his life with no one needing him, trying to figure out what he is for, when what he is for is just himself. What I keep coming back to, having spent a long evening going through all of this, is how much the show trusts its audience. It trusts children to handle complex feelings. It trusts them to sit with ambiguity, with characters who are right and wrong simultaneously, with endings that don't resolve neatly. It trusts that you don't need the lesson announced to receive it. And there's quite a bit more I could talk about. Individual episodes that deserve much more time than we gave them. The fan community, which produced a genuinely impressive amount of art and analysis and emotional investment over the years the show was running. The way the show's visual design changed across seasons, becoming more confident and stranger as it went. I might come back to some of those things in future videos, if that sounds useful. For now, though, that's enough. That's quite a lot, actually. If you made it this far, or fell asleep somewhere in the middle and drifted back, I hope it was useful for whatever you needed tonight. There's something pleasant about spending time with a piece of work that tried, seriously and with care, to say something true about what it's like to be a person who feels things and doesn't always know what to do with that. Steven Universe tried, genuinely, imperfectly, beautifully tried. That's worth something. Sleep well.